If you're trying to decide on whether or not to buy a new or used table saw or other shop machine, you're aware at this point that there's just a ton of information and a plethora of options out there for you to choose from before you can actually move forward with the decision. I actually chose to purchase a 1940s Walker Turner 10-inch table saw to restore that back to 100% functional life for use in my shop. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of disassembling the machine and cleaning the cast iron tabletop surfaces as well as the extension wings. I've already restored the tabletop surfaces, but you're going to have to wait till the end of the video to see how that came out. So let's get started right now. Before I take these wheels off, I wanted to point out something that I noticed throughout the course of this project and looking at the machine, but I never really understood what was different. This one over here for the bevel tilt is turned around. What I'm gonna do is take these two off, get those out of my way before I go ahead and flip the machine over so I can separate the tabletop from the base. Along the way, just keep in mind if you're disassembling machines, you're gonna have parts in specific areas of that machine. So you wanna have yourself handy some bags with labels or tape and a Sharpie so that you can go ahead and mark those parts as you take them out, and that way you'll have less of a chance of getting yourself turned around once you get back to the end and you're trying to put it back together. This was supposed to be on this way, and this knob here is supposed to be on the other side, so I have to work that out. This is a good point in the disassembly to show a feature of this mechanism here. I think I was about to take this stuff off, get it out of my way before I moved everything and flipped it over, but I discovered that I don't want to do that. This is actually a bearing system in here. These two screws hold in the cap and the housing for the bearing. So I'm definitely going to leave that. Then I'm going to leave these on because if I take that off, the whole system will start flopping around as I flip it. So I don't want that, and I don't want to lose any parts of these bearings in here. So taking a closer look at the underside of this, there's just 2 bolts on either side, so that's 4 total. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove this faceplate here. I think that's my first setback or opportunity. The weld for this flange to the base here just broke, I think. So I'll have to have that tack welded back on there at some point. Let me get the others and see what I'm dealing with here. All right, so I went ahead and put some penetrant lubricant on each of these faceplate screws just to loosen them up, and this is just generic tool tech. You can pretty much use any kind you want. That's what I have. A lot of people want to use brand name WD-40. That works too. Use what you have around. Another good tool to have is just a telescoping magnet. So if you end up dropping something small into a little area, crevice or whatever, you can get that piece in there and just pull it out with the magnet. There it is. Tons of sap buildup from over the years of use, but still in really good condition. A very tricky part of this whole restoration is going to be these emblems. They're not screwed on there It's actually, it looks like it's a rivet. Next step, I'll remove the bearing system here for the bevel worm gear and see how much closer that gets me to being able to remove the base from the top. Alright, so this is getting pretty messy and tricky all at the same time. I'm not sure if the bearing is not coming off of here because the rod is too marred up, so it's just binding, but it is pretty rusty, so I'm going to go ahead and hit it with some wet dry sandpaper, see if I can smooth that up a little bit, see if that helps me get this bearing off of here. Well, I certainly hope I can replace that bearing right there, but success, look at that. I've finally realized that in order to take the base off from the table, I need to remove the bevel worm gear because that is preventing it from lifting up because the slot on that side is enclosed, so there's no way for it to move. Before I do that, I need to remove the jam nuts, and these allow you to set a stop position for the tilt. So once I get this thing put back together, I'll incorporate that as I calibrate the blade. And everything in here, I don't know, you guys can't see that, but for the most part, everything in there is in such good condition. I mean, it really was quality steel they used in manufacturing processes, so I keep getting more and more excited. Besides some of the opportunities I'm gonna have to overcome, the project is just gonna be, it's just such a privilege to work with a machine of this caliber, and hopefully I can get it back to functional life again. That's it. Hopefully that's the last little piece before I can take this base off. Let's check it. Okay, all those are intact. I didn't want to risk breaking anything here. I know the trunnions can get weak over time, and there's so much pressure between that and the tabletop that if you loosen those bolts, sometimes they'll just crack. What I'm seeing is this actually does have some room to move as I loosen these. This trunnion system moves ever so slightly, and that actually helps you because sometimes you end up only being out 10 to 15 thousandths. And so when you go to set that blade, it makes it a little easier if you have that wiggle room. So I'm gonna try to, once I get to that point, I'll try to set these. Try to get this pretty close during the reassembly process though, because it really is a pain to adjust this style of saw once everything is reassembled. All right, not too bad. That's everything disassembled. My main focus is going to be getting the tabletop surface restored, so that's what I'm going to hit up next. I've got the Tabletop's vacuumed off. There was a ton of dust that came out once I started moving everything, so it's all ready to go. What I'm going to use is this Citrus Scent Stripping Gel. And I've got just a little container, cheap paintbrush, some gloves, and then I'm going to finish it off with some plastic wrap. So what that's going to do is after I finish it, I'm going to cover this with that and just let it sit overnight, and hopefully that will keep everything from drying out and allow the chemical to work really well and get deep into the scrapes and scratches on here. Just going to paint it on. I'll just leave this overnight and we'll see what it looks like in the morning. I can tell it's already removing quite a bit. The white paint is already kind of gooey in there, so check it in the morning. It's the next day, everything sat overnight. Definitely looks like this stuff worked pretty well. So let me go ahead and remove this plastic and see what we're dealing with. Yeah, I mean, that's scraping right off. So I want to try some mineral spirits on this just to see if that will help get some of the residue up. The mineral spirits got most of the residue off. I'm going to go ahead and put one more coat of the CitriStrip on there just to make sure I got everything. I've got the second coat of the stripping gel done, wiped everything with mineral spirits, and while I was doing that work, I decided I am going to paint these underneath here. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of the stripping of this all the way down to the metal now, then come back and get the tabletop surfaces looking nice. And the reason for that is the underside is going to be a beast, and so I don't want to get these looking all freshed up and then potentially just scratch that work while I'm moving it around to do the paint scraping underneath. So that's the next step. All right, so I began work getting the paint off the underside. My original plan was to use a wire brush and a pneumatic die grinder. That didn't work. So what I thought is, let me give the CitriStrip a try. This is a manufacturer paint. It's old, but it is a pretty high quality paint, so I wasn't sure if it would work. But what I did is I put a first layer down and agitated that in with a cheap wire brush here. And the purpose of that was to just get through the sap and everything that's built up over the years. So that's what you're seeing here. That's that first layer. It's agitated in there. I'm going to cover it with the plastic wrap, let that sit, take that off, and then I'll put another coat of CitriStrip on there to then get down to the paint. I've already tested it right here, and I think that's going to work. I was able to expose the cast iron underneath here, so I think that's the way I'm going to go. So what I learned from the failure of my first attempt is that when life throws you lemons, hit it back with some CitriStrip. Link in the description. All right, everything is sat for about 6 hours. So I'm going to take up this plastic, scrape everything a little bit more, wipe it down, and see if I need a second coat of the stripping gel. All right, I think that looks pretty good so far. I'm going to do one more coat, See if I can get every last bit off here before I do a final rinse. All right, so this next coat sat overnight. It's ready to rinse off. I've got it in a tub of Simple Green and water. It's diluted to about 1 to 10. So I'm gonna scrub all this, wash it down, and then rinse it. I've got some fresh water here. And then when I'm done with each piece, I'm gonna run them outside and spray them off immediately. I've got compressed air waiting for me, just so I can get this water off it as soon as possible. So let me get started. All right, everybody, that's about it for this step. As you can see, I got through most of the paint. So I'm gonna leave it just like this, and I'll come back before I prime it and hit it one more time with a wire brush just to knock off any contaminants that might accumulate between now and then. For now, let me flip it over to the top and I'll show you what I'm working with. All right, so this is the top after just getting off all the paint. I will say that if this is coming through in the camera, this actually made me just a little bit sad. I'm not sure what happened here, but it looks to me like a grinder was used to try to remove a stain at some point. However, I am gonna keep the option open to have these remachined. So if you're seeing this video and you've made it this far, please comment below if you know anybody in the Virginia area that has the capacity to remachine this tabletop. Anyway, so let me show you what I do to restore the tabletop. I'm actually using a drywall sanding backer. I think that's gonna work pretty well and it'll give me lots of leverage. So look for something like this. I'll see if I can find a smaller one that I know will fit the different sizes of sandpaper you might have access to. I always like to have a dry sponge because they get pretty stiff and they work really well as a backer to get into fine detail areas. Spray lubricant. It's just a lubricant to keep the particles from clogging up the sandpaper. I have access to 400, 600, 1000, and 2000 grit, so that's what I'm using. You can use any combination of sandpaper that are close to that. What we're looking for is ultimately a polish. Let me get into this and I'll show you a little bit from each step. All right, that's good for the 400. Before I move on to the 600, I'm gonna hit the miter slots, the throat plate area, and the sides. A couple things I want you to consider while you're doing this is that you want to count your passes so that you're not spending too much time in just one area and it's uneven compared to the rest of the surfaces. For me, I'm doing about 15 to 20 passes before I move on. When I move on, I'm only shifting over about 1/3 the width of the sandpaper, or at the most 1/2, so that as I'm going over, everything is staying consistent. So what you're trying to avoid with counting passes is that you're not going to spend more time in one area here than you are over here. So you can either count your passes or the amount of time you spend in an area. What you don't want to do is spend 5 minutes here and then 15 here. How do you know when to move on to the next grit? Other than being able to visibly see how far into the stains you've gotten, that's your first option. The second that you want to use with that is as you start a new grit of sandpaper, it's going to feel very rough. Even a finer grit is going to feel rough initially. So the more you sand, the smoother that connection between the material and the sandpaper is going to feel. So just as you make your passes, just kind of gauge how does it sound? Does it sound coarse? Is that smoothing out over time? So once it actually glides more freely, that's how you're going to know it's time you can move on to the next step, because essentially the sandpaper surface, the grit of that sandpaper is now mirrored on your material and they are sliding freely. When you're doing the miter slots, the throat plate, or any other slots on your machine, especially those that have tolerances, you want to be very minimal in your sanding because you don't want to get in there, especially like the miter slot, you don't want to go too crazy because then when you come back to put a miter gauge in there, there's just going to be too much wobble. So for your slots, you want to be very minimal in the sanding. Even if you can't get the stains out, you just want to be very careful how much you're taking off. Also, you want to sand in the direction that the material is going to pass. Ultimately, that's going to help everything move and glide a lot more smoothly after you get done waxing it. And the general consensus is that a crowned tabletop surface is better than a convex. So what that's going to do is still allow you, even if it's not perfectly flat, you're still going to be able to maintain a consistent cut. So keep that in mind as you're working. You don't want to round the edges. So what I do is when I get to an edge, I either make sure I'm only hanging over just a little bit, but all my pressure is on this side so that it's just riding along the surface but not rounding it. When I'm spanning a surface, I just have it angled a little bit, or in this case, it's wide enough that it's spanning. So as I'm moving from left to right, I'm just encountering it normally, and then I'm just going along and spanning both surfaces, and then just continuing to move on. So keep those points in mind as you begin to get working on your own saw. So let's get started on this 600 grit. All right, that's pretty good for the 600. Now I'm gonna move on to the 1000 grit. All right, that about does it for the 1000 grit. Moving on to 2000 next. All right, that's it for the 2000 grit all the way around. Let me get this thing wiped up and we'll see what it looks like. All right, I think that's a pretty good result for doing this all by hand. And just another reminder, make sure in between sandpaper grits you're wiping it down, getting all the lubricant off, and then come back with mineral spirits and clean paper towels to clean it up again before you move into that next step. All right, so this is the result I was able to achieve by hand for the most part. I actually did the same process on these extension wings off camera, but I actually had 2-inch sanding discs that attached to my drill, so I used that. It's the exact same process, just going through successive grits of sandpaper, but I found that those actually worked pretty well on this stamped steel, so that was the only change there. Everything else is the same. Any other process that you saw me do this, it's repeatable for any other part. I also have another video on that. Just keep in mind, in this particular case, I didn't need to use the wire brush on the top. I would save the wire brush, that initial step, if you have something that really has deep milling marks and that rust has gotten in there. The wire brush is great for agitating that. But for now, I'm gonna leave this here. My next video, I'm going to dive into this Trunnion mount system, and this thing is just an absolute beast, but it's in such great condition. However, I want to give myself some time just in case the bearings or any parts inside here need to be replaced. The bearings are a little rough. Maybe they just need to be greased. I'm not sure yet. I'll know more once I take that apart. So I'll go ahead and get this covered up. I'll get started on this, and we'll see you soon.